Hey guys, so the majority of you playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Are probably aware of SEAMO's progression series where SEAMO and NimNim would open 24 packs of each core booster set and build a deck and play a match, and continue doing so with each booster set that released. So it was a really cool way of going through the history of this card game and really sparked a movement of sorts where countless other players took on the challenge. Now, Farfa asked me if I could do a data video on the series since it is now almost caught up to the most recent set released, so I thought I'd take a stab at it, although I am certainly limited in what I can do because I can't just watch hours and hours of progression series content again. So as much as I'd like to do something like how often someone won when they played certain cards, that just was not feasible. Now, as I was collecting the data for this video, one really incredible resource that helped out in getting some of the info I needed was the Progression Series wiki page, which has just loads of really good and interesting information. I'll link down below and you can check it out, and make sure to give Invader Weasel a follow on Twitter since he created the wiki page. So at the time of recording this video, the most recent episode released was Chaos Impact, which was officially released in the TCG back on October 25th, 2019, with the most notable card being IP Masquerena. So this is the farthest we'll be able to go for this video, starting with of course the Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon that started off the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game back in 2002. Now so far, SEAMO has certainly taken a commanding lead in the series, winning 47 matches compared to NimNim's 26. SEAMO also won 10 matches in a row, and I believe he also won 9 matches in a row at some point. NimNim meanwhile has won 4 matches in a row, which is his best streak, and he's done that twice. Now if we were to break down the wins by era, and I'm going to be breaking down a lot of the results by each era, in the Duel Monsters period, which covers the Legend of Blue Eyes to Flaming Eternity, not gonna lie, SEAMO really beat the shit out of Gage, winning 11 of the 14 matches. Now during this period, there wasn't really much of an archetype deck building going on, although they were both on Gravekeepers, and NimNim also had Chaos Emperor Dragon near the end as well. Moving on to the GX era, which covered the Lost Millennium to Light of Destruction, and where at this point we still don't have any new extra deck summoning mechanics other than Fusion. It was actually really close where SEAMO just edged out with 7 wins versus 6 wins for NimNim. Near the start of this era, their lists weren't too different from the previous era, although the inclusion of Cyber Dragon was nice, and SEAMO eventually went into a Macrocosmos stun sort of strategy, and NimNim had some Dark World cards, but most importantly, got to add Dark Armed Dragon during this time. Then we move on to the 5Ds era with the introduction of Synchros, covering the Duelist Genesis to Extreme Victory. SEAMO does take a commanding lead in this era, winning 8 of the 12 matches. This was where SEAMO started out with the Light Sworn strategy and then moved on to the infamous Blackwing Damage Step Kalut for game playstyle. NimNim on the other hand also had a small Light Sworn package along with some Trebon stuff with his Dark Armed Dragon strategy, and stuck with this for most of the era. Next we have the Zexal era that introduced the Xyz mechanic, and this period covered Generation Force to Primal Origin. Record-wise, SEAMO took a strong lead this time as well, winning 8 of 12 matches once again. At this point, SEAMO largely relied on Blackwings yet again, with some Gravekeepers coming back as well. NimNim started out with more so Frog Monarchs and eventually Inzectors, but I think this time was best known for his Dragon Ruler strategy. Now we move on to the Arc 5 era with the Pendulum Summon mechanic, covering the infamous Duelist Alliance set up to Maximum Crisis. SEAMO did pretty well here as well, winning 7 of the 12 matches. This was where SEAMO used the Shaddoll strategy quite a bit, but also made use of the Pendulum mechanic with decks like Ignites and Dynamis. NimNim on the other hand continued with Dragon Rulers to start, but eventually move on to decks like Deskbots and Paleofrogs. And finally we have the Modern era in Vrains, which introduced the Link summoning mechanic, starting with the Code of the Duelist and up to Chaos Impact, but of course would keep on going as this is our current era. So far, SEAMO has taken the lead once again, winning 6 of the 10 matches. SEAMO brought back the Blackwing strategy yet again here, but I think it's been most interesting that he is now running Orcust, while NimNim is currently running Subterra Guru. Cool to see the evolution of deck strategies used throughout the series. Now if you were to look at whether SEAMO or NimNim decided to go first or second after winning the die roll, or technically rock paper scissors, then the first 3 eras you actually see the winner of the die roll wanting to go second more and more. So for example, by the time they got to the 5Ds era, whoever won the die roll chose to go second 100% of the time. Since they didn't draw on the first turn like how it was back in those times, going second with the extra card was advantageous. Now also because they are limited to the cards they pull from packs rather than running the exact deck lists that were meta at that period, there was probably a longer delay in eventually wanting to go first after winning the die roll because that advantage wasn't really there. However, once you move on to the last 3 eras, you see that whoever won the die roll decided to go first more and more often with each era. You see that in Zexal period, they decided to go first for game 1 about 2/3 of the time, and then 3/4 of the time in the Arc 5 era, and now in the current Vrains era, 80% of the time, the player who won the die roll chose to go first. At this point, I think they have enough of the modern era cards and archetypes where going first is now the more advantageous strategy, just as how Yu-Gi-Oh! Is now currently. Now, because they are playing traditional format, they are still allowed to run banned cards. Also, I am talking about banned cards in terms of cards that are banned at this current moment, as in November 2021, rather than cards that were banned in the era that they were playing in. Now, the number of banned cards in the main and extra deck combined of course range for each match depending on the deck they were running, but if you were to look at the most common occurrence of the number of banned cards in each era, referred to as the mode in statistical terms, then in the first couple of eras both SEAMO and Nim Nim had 5 banned cards. This would subsequently grow where in the Zexal era, Nim Nim most commonly played 11 cards in the main and extra that would currently be considered as banned. This has toned down a bit since, but as of this current Vrains format, both SEAMO and Nim Nim are playing 9 banned cards most of the time. Also keep in mind that these numbers are not based on unique number of cards, so for example if they were running 3 Destrudos, then that would still count as 3 banned cards rather than 1 unique banned card. Next, I wanted to look at the proportion of monsters, spells, and traps in their decks for each era. This was because I thought that this would sort of show the evolution of deck building over time in this game where, for example, we generally saw the play of trap cards eventually go down over time because people moved away from battle traps like Mirror Force, Dimensional Prison, and the like. So what I did was I took the average proportion of monsters, spells, and traps for each era, so each of these graphs will add up to 100%. So what you see is that for SEAMO at least, you see the proportion of traps in his deck grow a bit larger but eventually come down as we hit the modern era. As for Nim Nim, the proportion of traps as well as monsters and spells stayed relatively similar throughout the era. Now one thing to note is that since again they are limited to the cards they pull from packs, the decks they run, they don't necessarily represent the evolution of deck building over time in this game. If I were to analyze the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Series where they actually do play the meta decks of each set, then we may see that trend I was expecting where the deck ratios start favoring towards monsters and spells rather than traps. Now let's cover the win percentage based on die roll result for each era, so I will just cover SEAMO's win percentage by die roll here because Nim Nim's would essentially be the inverse of that, but I do have the numbers for Nim Nim as well on here for easier reference. So in the DM era, SEAMO actually won only 2 die rolls of the 14 matches, although he did win both of those matches. Even when he lost the die roll, he still won 3/4 of the matches in that era. As for the GX era, I suppose winning the die roll did lead to a higher win percentage for both of them, and keep in mind that at this point they were both largely trying to go second. Next, in the 5Ds era, winning the die roll really did not seem to matter clearly. I mean, SEAMO actually won all of the matches where he lost the die roll, and did worse when he won the die roll. The Zexal era was also rather weird in that whoever won the die roll actually did much worse, and this was the period where whoever won the die roll started wanting to go first more often than going second, like before. Starting with the Arc 5 era, we do see that winning the die roll seems to matter more now, considering that they both want to go first, where they both won 75% of the matches when they won the die roll. That brings us to the current Vrains era, where at least for SEAMO, winning the die roll still does matter and led to a higher win percentage. Will be interesting to see how much the die roll starts to matter now that they have more modern strategies that they're running. Lastly, I thought I'd try to bring some win percentages for a couple of decks played often by SEAMO and Nim Nim. And this doesn't really mean decks that were played most often by them, because earlier on in the series they ran decks that did not necessarily fit as a complete archetype, with some Gravekeeper or Lightsworn cards here and there. So for SEAMO, I think it's clear that the most well-known deck for the series is Black Wings, where he ran it for 16 matches and won 63% of the time. Another strategy he ran often was actually the whole stun strategy with cards like Macrocosmos, Dimensional Fissure, and Banisher of the Radiance. This strategy was also successful with a 75% win percentage. Some other decks that SEAMO's run include Dynamist and partial Shaddoll strategies as well, and Orcus as well now. As for Nim Nim, Dragon Rulers was one of his well-known decks, although his success was pretty even at 50%. I just put Despots here as the second deck, although he only ran it 5 times but did have success with it, winning 80% of the matches. Both players of course ran some generic chaos strategies earlier on in the series, and those decks were played more often than any of the other ones I listed, but again, didn't really involve a true archetype, so I went with the few decks that I showed today. Alright guys, so that was it for the analysis of the progression series. I know it was pretty limited in terms of the data I could pull, but hope you still found it somewhat entertaining. This series has certainly been really great for the game, and it's definitely been very interesting to see how the game has evolved over time. Anyways, that's it for me. Take care guys.